In a corridor of flickering candles and iron doors that breathe like sleeping beasts, imagine being accused of a crime where proving your innocence is impossible, and every word you speak coils back as proof of guilt. Tonight, we peel back the lies you've been told about the witch hunts, from men burned in the snow to judges who dared to doubt. And if you crave the truth, buried beneath centuries of smoke and screams, subscribe now so you don't miss what we're about to unearth. Start with a village sky the color of old ash. A cow dries up, a child coughs, a debt goes unpaid. Someone remembers a quarrel at the well and a name is whispered. This is how it begins. Not with demons, but with weather, hunger, pride, and the slow grinding logic of fear that turns neighbors into witnesses and witnesses into accusers. You picture medieval darkness, but the bonfires bloomed in the bright age of presses and telescopes. While painters chased light across ceilings, magistrates chased shadows across fields. Progress gave us tools to count the stars and to number the condemned, and both lists were copied, bound, and believed. The accused were not just wise women with secret herbs. They were carpenters, merchants, shepherd boys, widows with sharp tongues, and soldiers home from a losing war. The old stories smooth them into a single silhouette, but trial books show faces crowded together, ordinary and trembling, each caught on the hook of some petty feud sharpened by crisis. Roughly 1 in 4 accused was a man, and in Iceland the snow itself seemed to favor the gallows for them. In Swiss valleys, in Russian forests, statistics tilt and sway like pines in wind. Terror is not choosy, it selects whoever stands where suspicion is blowing hardest that season. The church is easy to blame, easier still to hate. But the hottest fires often roared in Protestant towns where councils promised safety at any cost. The Spanish Inquisition, of all unlikely arbiters, sometimes demanded evidence and frowned at torture-won truths, while far from those courts' village benches splintered beneath the weight of certainty. Picture a ledger on a magistrate's desk on one side, crop failure, frost, and war tax. On the other side, a widow who argued too loudly, a tinker who drank too much, a beggar turned away at dusk. The balance is off, so someone must pay, and the cheapest coin is a confession pressed from a shaking mouth. Listen closer to the testimonies. A churn went sour after a quarrel. A pig miscarried. A storm struck one roof but spared another. None of this is sorcery. All of it is grief translated into blame. The devil enters late like a lawyer called to tidy up a verdict already decided. In Würzburg, the winter bit like iron, and the courts worked like mills. Children named names between sobs, mothers denounced sons to save daughters, and the city learned how terror breeds arithmetic. The more you execute, the more reasons you invent to execute again. Beneath the prison floor, the flagstones remember what the records omit. Yet even here, doubt flickered. A priest who refused another blessing, a judge who noticed that torture makes every story rhyme, a clerk who wrote a question mark where others drew a noose. These thin threads are how the frenzy begins to fray, but not before the fabric of 100 parishes has been torn into smoke and silence. The myth that witches were mystical healers is comforting, but the archives tell another story. Most of those dragged before the courts were not brewing herbs under the moonlight. They were just ordinary souls caught in ordinary quarrels, their lives collapsing because someone's livestock sickened, or someone's pride was bruised at the wrong moment. Take Katharina Kepler, mother of the great astronomer, accused not for spells or charms, but because a neighbor hated her over a loan. When the neighbor's child fell ill, suspicion leapt like a spark, and suddenly the mother of one of history's sharpest minds was shackled as if she carried Satan's mark. The Renaissance, that golden age of thought, was also the season when witch hunts bloomed like black flowers. While Newton measured gravity, while Shakespeare filled the globe with verse villages, filled the air with smoke from pyres, and the paradox of enlightenment alongside terror still stains our memory. For centuries, the Church had dismissed belief in witches as superstition. Yet by the 15th century, something cracked. Reformation splintered unity. Printing presses spread panic faster than reason, and even the climate turned cruel in the Little Ice Age, pushing harvests to fail and farmers to search for scapegoats among their own. Imagine a courtroom where the evidence isn't talismans or potions but grudges. A woman who didn't bow properly, a man who skipped church, a beggar denied bread. The true crime was often social friction, and magic was simply the language chosen to justify punishment already desired. Agnes Waterhouse, remembered as one of England's earliest executed witches, was said to have a demonic cat. But the trial papers obsess more over her sharp tongue, her quarrelsome ways, and the dislike she stirred. The cat was theater. The verdict was vengeance. Witch hunts were social control dressed as divine battle. The threat of accusation kept communities' obedient tongues, measured behaviors trimmed to fit the narrow corridors of conformity, and anyone who stepped outside too far risked being painted with the devil's brush. Würzburg. Again, one of the darkest epics, over 900 accused, many of them children. Fear and frost walked hand in hand, and when fields froze and pantries emptied, townsfolk convinced themselves that executing another neighbor was the only way to thaw God's favor back into the soil. Trial records show spikes in accusations during the coldest winters of the Little Ice Age. Storms and frosts were read not as weather, but as witchcraft, as if frostbite on vines must mean a curse whispered at midnight. Science had not yet dethroned fear, and fear had its own calendar of blood. Political fractures sharpened the knives further where central authority was weak. Local councils grew drunk on power, proving their worth by finding witches. Each trial became a stage where officials displayed zeal, and each execution a grim theater ticket purchased by the village's desperation. The witch hunts were never just about faith, but about survival in chaos. Religion gave them vocabulary, but famine, war, and inequality gave them fuel, and once the fire started, it leapt across borders, devouring both Catholic and Protestant lands alike. In some places, the hunts took on the rhythm of epidemics, each accusation infecting another neighbors, naming neighbors until whole families were extinguished. Fear itself became the plague, carried by words whispered in markets and scribbled in parish records. Even the young were not spared. Children as small as 9 were dragged into courts, their wide eyes forced to gaze upon judges demanding answers they could not give their trembling hands, forced to sign names that damned parents, siblings, even playmates. Imagine the soundscape of such a trial, quills scratching furiously, chains clanking, the sob of a mother as her child points a shaking finger. Truth had no place here, only the performance of certainty, the crowd's hunger for resolution, and the crackle of pyres prepared outside. In one chilling case, a girl accused her grandmother of flying on a broom not because she saw it, but because she dreamed it. The court took the dream as fact, and within weeks the old woman was gone, swallowed by flames that cared nothing for waking or sleeping visions. Every community carried its own tinderbox rivalries over land, envy over harvests. Rumors of affairs and the witch hunts provided the match. Suddenly, disputes that once ended with curses muttered under breath now ended with bonfires roaring against the night. Beneath the sensational tales of devils and familiars, the real engine was despair. The colder the winters, the harsher the taxes, the hungrier the children, the more accusations sprouted. Witches became the explanation for every unanswerable why, every unbearable grief. Yet the records also reveal sparks of resistant scholars who argued that the devil had no such power. Priests who urged caution, even entire villages that refused to participate. These voices were drowned in the moment but survived in parchment reminders that hysteria was not unanimous. The machinery of torture, however, made resistance nearly impossible. Stretched on racks burned with irons, plunged into water. The accused confessed whatever the judges wanted to hear, and every forced confession was recycled as proof for the next arrest, a vicious loop with no exit. What made it most terrifying was the ordinariness. No grand conspiracy, no coven in the woods, just everyday lives shattered by ordinary fears, amplified until Europe itself seemed bewitched by its own shadow. The myth that witch hunts were only medieval shadows collapses under the weight of dates. The fiercest trials raged between 1450 and 1750, an age that also birthed telescopes, atlases, and symphonies. The contradiction is a mirror showing that progress and cruelty can flourish side by side. In the 10th century, the Church had dismissed witchcraft as illusion heresy. but by the 15th century, the tide reversed and Europe became a stage where learned men wrote treatises on demons while peasants trembled at every storm, believing the invisible hand of a witch stirred the clouds. Printing presses, that glorious engine of knowledge, also multiplied terror. Manuals like the Malleus Maleficarum spread from city to city, teaching judges and villagers alike how to spot, accuse, and condemn each copy, a torch passed into waiting hands. The Little Ice Age pressed its cold thumb on the land, turning summers gray and winters deadly. When crops failed, when children starved, whispers turned to accusations, and the frost outside was echoed by the fire rising in village squares. Political upheaval sharpened suspicion further. The Reformation tore apart religious unity, and each faction sought to prove its purity by hunting witches, while weak states and fractured towns found in trials a way to flex authority, as if executions could substitute for stability. The myth of the healer witch gained traction centuries later, romanticized in movements that sought to reclaim suppressed wisdom. But in the raw documents of trials, what we find is less enchantment than envy, less herbalism than hatred, less ancient knowledge than ordinary spite turned lethal. Still, healers did exist, and a few found themselves accused, but they were not the majority. Many continued practicing without persecution, respected by their neighbors, while others were scapegoated not for what they knew, but for who they angered. Witchcraft trials became grim performances, where everyday misfortunes spoiled milk. Sudden death failed harvests, were woven into stories of Sabbaths and demons, the fantastical stitched over the mundane to make executions feel like holy duty. Communities learned to police themselves by threat alone. Step too far from custom, and you might find yourself suspected. Conform too eagerly, and you might be suspected of hiding something darker. Fear drew the borders of behavior tighter than any law could. Yet within this landscape of dread, one truth burns brighter than myth. Witch hunts were less about witches and more about us, our need to explain disaster, our hunger to find villains, and our willingness to destroy the different when the world feels beyond control. In the Würzburg trials of the 1620s, the scale of hysteria became grotesque. Over 900 accused, from respected councilmen to children barely old enough to read. The city devoured itself, one accusation feeding the next, like wolves turning on their own pack. Surviving letters tell of schoolboys executed, their only crime being born in the wrong family or whispered about by the wrong classmate. Terror became the curriculum, and innocence no shield against the gallows. Parents denounced children. Children denounced parents. Families were torn apart by desperation, each hoping that by sacrificing a loved one they might save themselves. But the fire was never satisfied. It always demanded more wood, more names, more screams. Trial scribes filled page after page with confessions that sounded eerily alike because torture ensured every mouth repeated the same script. Devils with black books packed, signed in blood. Midnight feasts, details extracted until they became routine. A dark litany echoed across Europe. In Scotland, storms were blamed on witches consorting with the devil to sink ships, and entire covens were found through confessions pressed out by pain. Sailors lost to weather became martyrs of imagined sorcery, their deaths avenged on the innocent. Germany, Switzerland, France. Wherever famine or war struck hardest, the witch hunts surged. The map of persecution overlaps with maps of hunger and instability. Proof that fear doesn't float free, it anchors itself in misery and need. At the core of it all was the lie that persecution purifies. Authorities promised that each execution would cleanse the village of evil, but each body burned only deepened suspicion until ashes mingled with soil and seeded yet more doubt. Imagine the silence. After a burning, the crowd disperses. The air still reeks of smoke and charred wood, and neighbors return to homes emptier than before, carrying both relief and dread. For they know tomorrow the finger might point at them. Yet there were places where hysteria faltered. Some inquisitors questioned evidence, some towns refused to execute. Some scholars mocked the absurdity of flying ointments and broomstick journeys. Scattered sparks of reason flickered, though too faint to douse the wider blaze. By the 18th century, skepticism began to grow stronger. Trials dwindled and intellectual winds shifted. But the scars remained whole regions, depopulated lineages, broken, and myths hardened into legends that still twist our understanding today. The end of witch hunts did not arrive with a single proclamation, but with exhaustion. Communities drained of neighbors and trust finally recognized that no amount of fire restored crops or stilled storms, and the cycle of fear began to sputter out. Enlightenment thinkers exposed contradictions. How could a confession wrung from agony be truth? How could storms prove sorcery when they struck without pattern? How could God demand the death of children? Their words spread slowly, but they planted doubts that trials could not silence. Courts shifted focus, turning from witches to more tangible crimes, and central governments asserted control, curbing the chaotic zeal of local magistrates who once wielded accusations like weapons. Bureaucracy, ironically, became a shield against hysteria. Yet the myths endured, carried in folklore and hushed warnings, in bedtime stories told to keep children obedient. Witches became symbols of danger, rebellion, or secret wisdom depending on who was telling the tale. In the 19th and 20th centuries, the image of the witch transformed again, reclaimed by artists and activists as figures of resistance, misunderstood healers, rather than sinister outcasts. The legend evolved, but the pain of the past remained buried beneath. What makes this history terrifying is not only the cruelty inflicted then, but the reflection it casts now. The same mechanisms of fear, rumor, and scapegoating echo in our digital age, where accusations spread like wildfire and reputations burn without trial. Consider how quickly conspiracy theories grow today, how hunger for blame still seeks easy targets. The witch hunts remind us that progress does not erase our instincts, it only changes their stage and amplifies their reach. The lesson carved into those centuries of smoke is stark when crisis meets fear. Truth is the first victim, and ordinary people can become executioners in the name of safety or purity. But history also whispers of resistance communities that refused to participate, scholars who questioned, judges who doubted. Their voices show that hysteria is not inevitable, that courage can hold even when fear howls at the door. And so the witch hunts are not just stories of ashes and gallows, but mirrors held up to us, warning that the line between justice and persecution is thinner than we wish and easier to cross than we dare admit. When we look back at those centuries, it is tempting to dismiss them as a primitive age, but the witch hunts unfolded alongside discoveries that shaped our modern world, reminding us that knowledge and cruelty can coexist uncomfortably in the same society. The paradox is haunting. The same printing press that spread Copernicus's heliocentric theory also spread manuals on detecting witches. Innovation became a double-edged blade, sharpening both truth and terror. In that contradiction lies the real horror, not supernatural forces, but the human capacity to use progress as a weapon, turning tools meant to enlighten into engines of fear. Imagine standing in a square, the smell of parchment and ink from a nearby press mixing with the smoke of a pyre. One stall sells books on astronomy, another sells pamphlets condemning witches, the future and the past colliding in one breath. This collision teaches us that persecution does not arise from ignorance alone, but from the ways we bend knowledge to serve our fears, our politics, our need for control. The witch hunts were not an accident of darkness, but a product of society's very attempts to bring light. Even now, echoes persist. Digital witch hunts rage online, reputations ruined in hours. Mobs forming with a speed and reach the 17th century could never dream of. Yet the emotional mechanics are nearly identical. Accusations amplified by new technology spread faster than defense. Guilt is presumed, denial is proof of guilt, and the crowd demands punishment, not with firewood but with hashtags and exile from public life. The lessons of the past, if we heed them, are warnings to slow down, to question, before condemning, to remember that behind every accusation is a human face. Without such caution, we risk replaying history's darkest scripts with modern staging. Still, history also offers hope. For every community consumed by hysteria, another resisted. For every magistrate who yielded to fear, another doubted. These fragments remind us that resistance is always possible even when fear seems absolute. And so the story closes, not in flames but in reflection. The witch hunts were the most terrifying lie of the Middle Ages, and beyond a lie that fear could be destroyed by destroying our neighbors. May we remember, so that when the shadows of suspicion return, we choose courage, reason, and compassion instead of fire.